Hello DIY friends. You could just buy a Bluetooth speaker. But can you actually build one from a PVC pipe, a block of wood and a sheet of leather without it looking like a DIY fail? Let's find out together. At first it sounded simple, but then I had to figure out how to mount the pipe, make airtight brackets that were still removable, keep the whole thing repairable and hide the cables inside the wood. It certainly wasn't always smooth sailing. But by the end, I had something that actually worked and looked pretty close to what I imagined. I cut an 80mm PVC pipe to length for the housing, plus a few extra slices for the assembly. One piece I split lengthwise and flattened it with a heat gun at about 110 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to make it pliable, but not so hot that it turns into a chemistry experiment. Then I glued in a PVC ring to support the dividing wall that I cut out of the flat PVC sheet with the hole saw. I drilled the hole for the speaker wires and installed the wall using a bit of liquid silicone. That gives us two airtight chambers for the speakers. For the handle I used pine wood. It's easy to work with and looks decent for a first build. After gluing up a block, I broke it to length, squared it off and drilled out the handle using Forstner bits with the correct radius. With some not so graceful chiseling and sanding like a pro hip-hop DJ, the opening started to look like an actual handle. Now that the handle was done, I could move on to cut the block to the right shape based on the stencil. I also drilled cavities for the power switch and the DC port. With a bit of electrical tape, I ensured a snug fit of the switch and the port. I had to recess the power switch a bit more, so I had space to install my custom power button that would fit the design. By drilling a hole at a 90-degree angle on the existing hole, I linked them together to guide the wires towards the PVC tube. A small chiseled cable gutter allows me to get the DC cable from one side to the other in a neatly manner. I used a 3D printer for the grille with a 0.2 nozzle to get to the right level of detail. After a couple of iterations, I designed tiny side flaps that clip into the PVC tube. I also need to create some space for this little ring. The purpose for this will become clear later. For this radius detail, I had to cut away a bit of wood at the corners. For the mounts, I cut 10mm plywood rings, carved out the connector space and added some screw holes. To make them airtight, I wrapped the edges with electrical tape. With a sharp edge, I created a chamfer to easily install the mounting rings. I also had to slightly adjust the speakers for them to fit the tube. Then I installed a PVC ring as a stopper on one side and used parts of a ring on the battery side in order to make the battery fit. I prepped the speaker wires, installed them and closed the wall with silicone. For the DC cables, I made sure to check the polarity and then I glued the wires neatly into the wood using hot glue. I hooked the switch to the positive DC cable, as this serves as the interrupter to power off the speaker. And finally I drilled a hole to get to the battery side. Mounting the handle gave me headaches at first, but in the end, lining it up and hitting it with hot glue worked like a charm. Sometimes simple wins. I used a 24 volt 3000 mAh battery pack with a cooling pad on top. Otherwise the Bluetooth module overheats and will take a nap. Then I connect all the wires and check if the Bluetooth module fires up. To sum up the wiring, the charging port goes into the battery out goes to the switch to the module, and the module powers the speakers. Now I just had to jam everything in there, connect the speakers and add a little screw for the closing mechanism. For this build, I'm using a 2mm thick leather sheet as I like the look and the feel of it. Over time it will create a wonderful patina and build character. To install this, I'm using contact glue. I apply a first layer, let it get dry to the touch, and apply a second layer before bringing the parts together. Before finishing the second side, I rough cut the handle opening for easy access. Before trimming the leather, I glued some magnets into the grille and installed it into the tube as it serves as a guiding surface for the trimming. I'm not a professional leather worker, so I tried different cutting tools and found that a wide chisel in a rocking motion gave me good control along the edges. To get a good transition from the wood to the grill, I made the wood a little bit too big and trimmed it down with the chisel. I used fine sandpaper to finish the edges and a fresh scalpel to clean up the handle cutout. After degreasing the button, I installed a small spacer and topped it off with a custom beechwood cap, glued in epoxy. Now that it's finished, let's actually look at the product itself. The idea was to keep it simple and minimal, but still unique. The leather wrap feels premium and will age nicely, while the pine handle adds contrast and makes it practical to carry. Laying it flat, the handle detail really stands out. But not everything is perfect. It's clear to see I'm not that good with leather yet. The fitting could have been tighter, and perhaps a big radius on the handle would improve ergonomics. Still, for a first build with just PVC, wood and leather, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. It looks different, it works, and most importantly, it's repairable. I would love to read your thoughts in the comments, and stick around because in the next video I'll share a 3D printable version with all the dimensions so you can make your own. That's it for this build. Catch you in the next one.